For 9 days I watched a single ship cross the most heavily defended space in the galaxy. And on the 9th day I understood that the Imperium I had served my whole life was about to be destroyed. Not by that ship's weapons, but by what it was carrying, and by the one thing an empire built on fear has never known how to fight. Let me tell you who I am because it matters to how I saw this. My name is Korven. I'll render it the way your tongue can hold it, Korven, and I was a sensor analyst, 3rd tier in the watch of the Imperial Core. That tells you almost everything about me if you know the Ascendant Imperium, and if you don't, I'll explain. The Imperium was a caste empire. Everything in it was ranked, from the Emperor's bloodline at the apex down through the high castes and the service castes and the labor castes to the dust at the bottom, and you were born into your tier and you died in it. And the whole vast machine of the Imperium existed to keep that order frozen forever. I was service caste, 3rd tier, high enough to sit at a sensor station in the holiest defended space the Imperium possessed, low enough that no one would ever ask my opinion about anything. I watched. That was my function. I read the deep space sensors that ringed the Imperial Core, and I reported what I saw, and I was very good at it. And I expected to do it until I died and be replaced by someone else who would do it exactly the same way. That was the Imperium. Nothing changed. Nothing was ever supposed to change. I want to tell you what it does to a person to be born into a frozen place. You learn not to want. That is the first thing the Imperium teaches you, before you can even speak. That wanting is for the high castes. That ambition above your tier is not just forbidden but obscene, a kind of disease, and that the way to live a peaceful life is to fold your wanting up small and put it somewhere deep and never take it out. I was good at that too. I had a quick mind, too quick for my tier, if I am honest, the kind of mind that sees 3 steps past where it is supposed to stop. And I had spent my whole life teaching that mind to be quiet, to see and not speak, to notice and not care. Because a 3rd-tier analyst who noticed too much and cared too loudly was a 3rd-tier analyst who would be removed and replaced by one who didn't. I had a mate in the service quarters, and we did not speak of wanting more, because there was no more to want. There was only the tier, and the watch, and the slow turning of the frozen order forever. I tell you this so you understand what it meant later, when a single human ship taught a dust-born analyst that the frozen thing could move. I did not know I was unhappy. You cannot know you are unhappy when unhappiness is simply the shape of the air you have always breathed. I learned it from the humans. They taught me, among other things, that I had been grieving my whole life for a freedom I did not know existed. The Imperial Core was the center of everything. Picture it, a single perfect system, the throne world at its heart, ringed by defenses that had never in the Imperium's 10,000-year history been breached, fortress moons, weapon platforms beyond counting, fleets stationed in layers like the rings of an ancient tree, and beyond all of it, the deep space sensor net that I helped to watch, a web of detection that could see a cold rock tumbling at the edge of the system from days out. Nothing approached the core unseen. Nothing approached the core unauthorized. The whole point of the core, the entire meaning of it, was that it was untouchable, the still and perfect center around which the frozen order of the Imperium turned. To stand a watch there was the great honor of my small life. I felt it every shift. I, dust-born service caste, sat at the heart of the unbreakable thing. Let me give you the watch chamber, so the place is real to you. It was a vast dim hall deep inside one of the fortress moons, ringed with sensor stations, and at every station a service caste analyst like me, and above us on a raised tier. Everything in the Imperium was tiers, even the floor you stood on. The high caste officers who received our reports and made the decisions, and never once, in all my years there, looked any of us in the eye. The light was the cold blue of the sensor displays. The air was filtered and recycled and smelled of nothing, of metal and ozone, and the faint dry scent of a place where nothing living was meant to be comfortable. It was quiet. The core was always quiet because nothing ever happened there. That was the whole point. the perfect untroubled quiet of a center that could not be threatened, and the quiet had a texture, a weight, the heavy stillness of 10,000 years of nothing ever changing pressing down on every shift. I had stood 10 years of watches in that chamber and reported in total not one thing that mattered: drifting rocks, tributary convoys with proper authorization, the occasional lost trader who turned back the instant we challenged them. 10 years of nothing in the holiest quiet in the galaxy. I thought I would stand 10,000 more. And then, on an ordinary shift, in the deep quiet of the third watch, my sensors found something they were not supposed to find. A single contact. Far out at the very edge of detection where the sensor net thinned. One ship. Unknown configuration. It matched nothing in our registry, not Imperial, not any of the tributary species, not any of the powers we knew. And it was not behaving the way ships behave when they stumble accidentally into Imperial space. It was not drifting. It was not fleeing. It was not broadcasting the desperate identification codes of a lost trader who has realized where they are. It was running dark, and it was running fast, and it was on a course that my board computed and recomputed 3 times because I could not believe it. A course that did not waver and did not deviate and pointed like a drawn line at one single place in all the vastness of the system. It was headed straight for the Imperial Core, straight for the throneworld, straight for the apex of the Imperium, the holiest and most defended point in 10,000 years of unbroken order, and it was coming alone. I want you to understand what that meant to those of us who saw it first. It was not possible. It was not a thing that happened. In 10,000 years, no single vessel had ever pointed itself at the core and simply come, because to do so was to die. The defenses would see you days out, and you would be challenged, and if you did not turn back you would be destroyed long before you reached anything that mattered, and everyone in the galaxy knew this. It was the most basic fact of galactic existence. You do not approach the Imperial Core. And here was one ship, one, doing the impossible thing, the suicidal thing, coming on alone and unwavering toward the center of an empire that could field 1,000,000 ships to stop it. My supervisor did not believe me at first. Then the contact firmed, and the course held, and the disbelief went up the chain faster than I have ever seen anything move in the slow, frozen machine of the Imperium. Within an hour, castes far above mine were standing in our watch chamber, staring at my board, at the single impossible contact and its single impossible course. And I heard the word that would define the next 9 days passed from mouth to mouth in tones of disbelief and contempt, and the very first, faint edge of something the high castes were not used to feeling. Human, the ship was human. I knew little of humans then. They were a minor power, far from the core, one of the countless small peoples at the empire's edges, not a tributary, not a conquest, just one of the many species the Imperium regarded the way you regard insects in a distant field beneath notice, beneath even the effort of conquest. The high castes in our watch chamber spoke the word human with the particular contempt the Imperium reserved for the small, and they relaxed, slightly, because a human ship was nothing. A single human ship was less than nothing, and whatever madness had sent it on this course, it would die at the outer defenses like any other fool, and the perfect order of the core would remain unbroken, as it always had. There was a high officer there. I will call him the Watchlord, because his true title is a thing your tongue cannot hold, and because he is the one I came to understand best in the days that followed, which is to say not well but better than I understood any of the others. He stood over my board with his arms folded in the high caste way, and he looked at the impossible contact and he laughed. A short, certain, contemptuous laugh. One human ship, he said to the chamber, has decided to die at the center of the galaxy instead of somewhere unremarkable. Let it. Destroy it at the third defensive layer and log it as an aberration. And he turned to leave, the matter closed, the order given, the frozen quiet about to resume, because that was what always happened. The threat was challenged, and the threat turned back, or the threat was destroyed, and the perfect center went on being perfect. He had stood as many empty watches as I had. He had no more reason than I did to believe that this time would be different. I did not relax. I want to tell you why, because it's the beginning of everything I came to understand. I was a sensor analyst, third tier, and my whole function was to see what others missed, and what I saw on my board in the cold numbers was a thing that did not fit the contempt of the high castes. The ship was not behaving like a fool. A fool blunders. A fool panics, deviates, broadcasts, flees when challenged. This ship did none of that. Its course was too clean. Its approach was too deliberate. Whoever was flying that single human vessel knew exactly where they were going and exactly what waited for them. Knew they were one ship against the unbreakable core. Knew they would almost certainly die, and was coming anyway on a course as steady as a heartbeat, as if death were not a deterrent but simply a cost they had already accepted and paid in advance. I had never seen anything come at the Imperium like that. Nothing did. The whole order of our existence rested on the certainty that the threat of overwhelming force would turn anyone back, because everyone, in the end, fears death and calculates the odds and chooses survival. That was the Imperium's deepest assumption, the bedrock under 10,000 years of frozen order, that fear works, that the unbreakable core was unbreakable because no one would dare. And here on my board was one small human ship daring, coming on steady and unafraid towards certain death, and some cold part of me, the analyst part, the part that saw what others missed, looked at that impossible steady course and felt the first thread of a fear I could not yet name. I sat with that course for a long time, on that first shift, while the high castes gave their routine orders above me. And the more I looked at it, the more it frightened me, in a way I could not have explained to anyone in my tier, because the fear was not of the ship. The ship was one vessel. We had 1,000,000. The fear was of what the ship meant. I had spent 10 years reading the intentions of contacts off cold numbers. It is most of what a good analyst does, reading the shape of a fear or a greed or a panic in the way a ship moves. And this ship moved like nothing I had ever read, because it had no fear in it to read. Every other contact in 10,000 years had carried its fear in its course. You could see the moment the lost trader realized where they were, the deceleration, the panic, the turn. This ship's course had no such moment, because there was no fear in it to produce one. Whoever flew it had looked at the unbreakable core, at the 1,000,000 ships, at the certainty of death, and had simply set it aside, filed it, paid it in advance, as I said, and come on. Because a thing that is not afraid to die cannot be deterred, and the entire Imperium, every defense, every fleet, every layer of the unbreakable core was built at its foundation on deterrence, on fear. We had 10,000 years of weapons to destroy anything that attacked us. We had nothing at all for something that simply was not afraid. I understood that dimly on the first day, watching the course hold. I understood it completely by the 9th. And in between, I watched the proudest empire in the galaxy slowly, horribly, come to understand it too. The high castes ordered the outer defenses to challenge the ship, and if it did not turn, destroy it. Routine, certain. The matter, they were sure, was already closed. And I sat at my board and watched the single human vessel receive the challenge of the Imperial Core, the demand to identify, to turn back, to submit, the demand that 10,000 years of galactic history had taught every living thing to obey. And I watched the human ship's response come back across my sensors, and it was the first of the 9 days, and it was the moment I understood that something had come into the Imperium that the Imperium had no idea how to face. The human ship did not turn, it did not submit, it did not even slow. I remember the exact feeling in the watch chamber when the course held after the challenge. The watchlord had stopped at the door, half-turned, expecting. We all expected. The contact to waver, to decelerate, to do the thing every contact in 10,000 years had done when the core demanded submission. And it did not. The course on my board stayed as straight as a drawn line, the velocity steady, the ship coming on as though the most fearsome demand in the galaxy had been a whisper it had not bothered to hear. And I watched the Watchlord's certainty falter just slightly, just for a breath. The first crack, the first time in his life, I think, that the Frozen Order had not done what the Frozen Order always did, and he came back to my board slowly, and he did not laugh this time. And then the human ship answered. It answered the challenge of the unbreakable core with a single transmission, broadcast in the clear on every Imperial frequency at once, so that not just the watch chambers but the whole system would hear it. The fortress moons, the fleets, the throne world itself, every tier of the Imperium from the Emperor's bloodline down to the dust. And the transmission was not a threat, and it was not a demand, and it was not the desperate plea of the doomed. It was 9 words. I have carried them for the rest of my life. The single human ship, alone, undefended, pointed at the heart of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, broadcast to all of us. We are bringing your lost children home. Stand aside. And the watch chamber went silent. I looked up from my board. We were not supposed to look up. Service caste kept their eyes on their stations, and I looked at the high castes on their raised tier, and I saw on the faces of the proudest beings in the galaxy a thing I had never seen there: confusion. Not fear, not yet. Confusion. Because bringing your lost children home was not in any threat doctrine the Imperium possessed. There was no defensive protocol for it. The core was built to repel weapons, fleets, invasions, and a single human ship had just announced that it was carrying not a weapon but a return, and the high castes did not know what that meant, and the not knowing was the first crack in 10,000 years of certainty. And somewhere in that silence, though none of us knew it yet, the 10,000-year order of the Ascendant Imperium had already begun to fall, not to a weapon, but to a sentence, and to the cargo behind it, and to the one human who had decided that the truth was worth flying into the heart of an empire to deliver. Let me tell you what was on that ship. Let me tell you about the 9 days. And let me tell you how a sensor analyst, 3rd tier, dust-born and frozen in his place forever, came to understand why the stars were right to fear the small, unremarkable species coming, alone and unafraid, straight for the throne. The Imperium tried to destroy the ship 4 times in the first 3 days. I watched all 4 attempts from my board, and watching them is how I learned what the human captain actually was, and what she was actually carrying, and why the most powerful empire in the galaxy could not bring itself to finish a single undefended vessel. The first attempt was simple. The 3rd defensive layer, where the Watchlord had ordered the ship destroyed, brought its weapons to bear. An array that could have vaporized a fleet turned on one small human hull, and the ship did not evade. That was the first thing that broke the pattern. A ship under attack runs, jukes, deploys countermeasures, does the desperate dance of survival. The human ship did none of it. It held its course, straight and steady, into the teeth of weapons that could end it in an instant, and it broadcast again, in the clear, to the whole system. We will not fire on you. We are carrying your people alive. Check your own records. We are bringing them home. If you destroy us, you destroy them, and the whole galaxy is watching you do it. And the 3rd defensive layer did not fire. I need to make you understand why, because it is the heart of everything. The order had been given. The weapons were ready. 1 word from the high castes and the ship was gone. But the human captain had done something in those 2 transmissions that the Imperium had no doctrine for. She had made the act of destroying her ship into a thing the Imperium would have to explain. We are carrying your people. Check your own records. The whole galaxy is watching. She had not threatened the core with a weapon. She had threatened it with witnesses. And the high castes, for the first time in their lives, hesitated, because to destroy the ship now was not to repel an attacker, it was to be seen by the whole listening galaxy, murdering an unarmed vessel that claimed to be bringing the Imperium's own people home. And what if it was true? What if there were Imperial citizens on that ship alive, and the Imperium vaporized them in front of everyone? The high castes did not hesitate out of mercy. I want to be clear about that. They hesitated out of calculation. The first thing the human captain understood about them, that they feared exposure more than they feared any weapon, and the hesitation was the crack, and she drove into it. Because here is what the records showed, when the high castes finally, furiously, ordered them checked. 11 years before, the Imperium had lost a colony, not to war, to a disaster. A frontier world called Cethran's Reach, far out on the edge, a labor caste settlement, dust at the bottom of the Imperium's vast indifference. There had been a stellar event, a flare, a thing the Imperium's own monitoring should have caught and warned them of in time to evacuate, and the Imperium had not. The warning had gone up the chain and been deprioritized, because Cethran's Reach was a labor caste world, low tier, replaceable, not worth the cost of an emergency evacuation fleet. And by the time anyone of sufficient caste had bothered to decide, the window had closed, and the official record showed Cethran's Reach as lost with all hands. 140,000 labor caste lives, written off, filed, forgotten. The kind of thing that happens at the bottom of an empire that has decided some lives do not count. The kind of thing no one is ever supposed to hear about again. They had not all died. That was what the human ship was carrying. That was the cargo. Some of the people of Cethran's Reach had gotten off-world in the chaos, in whatever they could fly, scattered into the deep frontier in a few failing ships, refugees from a disaster their own empire had let happen. And out there, in the dark, dying slowly, abandoned by the empire that was supposed to protect them, they had been found by humans. A human survey expedition, far from home, had come across the dying refugees of Cethran's Reach, and had done the thing that the records of 211 days and 1,000 refused convoys say no one ever does. They had stopped. They had helped. And over 11 years, the humans had sheltered the survivors of Cethran's Reach, healed them, fed them, kept them alive. This small, unremarkable species taking in 100,000 abandoned strangers from an empire that regarded humanity as insects, and asking for nothing. And now, 11 years later, they were bringing them home, because the survivors of Cethran's Reach had wanted more than anything to go home, to the Imperium, to the frozen order that had abandoned them, because home is home even when home has failed you, and the humans, who do not leave people in the dark, had agreed to take them. One ship. One human captain willing to fly 100,000 of the Imperium's own abandoned children straight into the heart of the empire that had written them off, knowing the empire would rather destroy the evidence than admit what it had done. The human captain's name was Mara Sund. I learned it on the 4th day when she finally identified herself, and I will tell you about her, because by the end of the 9 days she was the most famous being in the Imperium and the most feared, and she never fired a single shot. She broadcast everything. That was her weapon, the only weapon she used, and it was the one weapon the Imperium could not counter. On the 3rd day, when the high castes ordered a 2nd and 3rd and 4th attempt to destroy the ship, quietly, this time trying to do it in the dark before the truth spread, Mara Sund broadcast the manifest, the names. All 140,000 names of the lost of Cethran's Reach, and which ones had died, and which ones were alive on her ship, broadcast in the clear to the whole Imperium, name after name, so that across the empire, in the labor caste quarters and the service tiers and everywhere the dustborn lived, people began to hear the names of the dead they had been told were all lost, and to hear among them the names of the living, brought home by humans. I felt the Imperium change around me as those names went out. I cannot describe it any other way. I was service caste. I lived among the lower tiers, and I felt the thing move through us as the names spread, a thing the Imperium had spent 10,000 years making sure we never felt. Because the lower castes heard those names and understood all at once, the thing the high castes most needed us never to understand, that the empire had abandoned its own. That 140,000 of us, labor caste, dust, the bottom, had been left to die because we did not count, and that the Empire had filed it and forgotten it, and that the only reason any of us knew was that a single human ship had flown into the heart of the core to tell us. The humans had not just rescued the survivors of Cthulhu's Reach. They had rescued the truth. And the truth, broadcast to 100 billion lower caste citizens who had spent their whole lives being told the order was perfect, and the high castes were wise, and the Empire protected them. The truth was the one weapon that could end the Imperium, and Mara Sund was flying it straight at the throne. The Watchlord understood it before most of the high castes did. I saw it happen on the 4th day in our watch chamber. He had been the one who laughed, who ordered the ship destroyed as an aberration, and now he stood over my board, watching the names scroll out across every frequency, watching his empire's deepest shame broadcast to its own people, and I saw the understanding land on him, the full weight of it. He said very quietly, almost to himself, in a voice I was not meant to hear, "We cannot destroy it. If we destroy it now with the names already out, we prove every word she said. And if we let it come—" He did not finish. He did not need to. If they let it come, 100,000 abandoned citizens would arrive alive at the throne world, living proof of the Empire's failure, welcomed home by a galaxy watching to see what the Imperium would do. And there was no version of that, no version at all, in which the frozen order survived intact. Destroy the ship and prove the crime. Let it land and display the crime. The human captain had flown one unarmed vessel into a position from which the most powerful empire in the galaxy could not extract itself. And she had done it without firing a shot, with nothing but the truth and the willingness to die for it. That was when I understood why the stars fear humans, not for their weapons. The Imperium had more weapons than the humans could dream of. The stars fear humans because a human will look at an empire built on fear and find the one thing the fear cannot touch. And a human, the right human, will fly straight into the heart of that empire, alone and unafraid, carrying the truth like a torch, daring the empire to murder her in front of everyone, knowing that whether she lives or dies, the truth gets out, because she has made her own death into the proof. You cannot deter that. You cannot bargain with it. You cannot even kill it usefully, because killing it only confirms it. The Imperium's whole 10,000-year strength was the ability to make people afraid, and Mara Sund was not afraid, and she had made 100 billion lower caste citizens stop being afraid too, just by reading them a list of names. On the 5th day, the survivors of Cthulhu's Reach began to broadcast. Mara Sund gave them her ship's transmitters, and one by one the abandoned came on the open channels and spoke to the empire that had left them to die. Not in rage mostly, but in something worse, something the high castes had no defense against. They spoke in grief, and in longing, and in the simple devastating testimony of people who had been told they were worth nothing and had been proven right by their own empire and saved by strangers. A mother spoke of the children she'd lost in the flare while the evacuation order sat unsigned. An old laborer spoke of 11 years among the humans, of being treated, for the first time in his life, as though his life had weight. And all of it went out, across the whole Imperium, to the dust-born billions, and I sat at my board in the holiest defended space in the galaxy, and I wept, service caste, 3rd tier, because the people on that ship were my people, the abandoned bottom of the empire, and a small, unremarkable alien had flown into the heart of everything to bring them home and tell our truth. But the Imperium was not finished. An empire 10,000 years old does not fall in 5 days, and the high castes, cornered, did the thing that cornered powers do. They reached for the one option that might still save the frozen order, the option that was monstrous and desperate and very nearly worked. And what Mara Sund did when they reached for it, on the 8th day, with her ship now deep inside the core and 100,000 lives in her hands and the whole galaxy watching. That is the last part of the story, and the part that taught me what humans will pay and refuse to pay when everything is on the line. I'll tell you, but hold on to this. 140,000 names went out across an empire that had erased them, and an empire that had been silent for 10,000 years discovered that it had forgotten how to make its own people afraid. On the 8th day, the high castes found their answer, and it was the kind of answer that only an empire built on fear could produce, because it was monstrous and clever in equal measure, and it very nearly worked. They could not destroy the ship, that would prove the crime. They could not let it land, that would display the crime. So they reached for the third option, the one that lives in the toolkit of every cornered power. They would change the story. If they could not stop Mara Sund, they would make her a liar. The Imperium controlled the narrative across 10,000 worlds. The high castes had spent millennia shaping what the Dustborn believed, and they decided in their desperation to drown the truth in a bigger story. They began to broadcast across every Imperial frequency, drowning out Mara Sund's transmissions with their own, that the human ship was not bringing survivors home but had stolen them, that the people of Cethran's Reach had not been abandoned but kidnapped 11 years ago by human raiders and held captive, and that this ship was not a rescue but a ransom, a human deception, a manipulation, the small treacherous aliens using stolen Imperial citizens as a shield to strike at the core, that the noble Imperium had grieved its lost colony and was now being taunted by the very thieves who took it. It was a good lie. I want to be honest about that, because the goodness of the lie is part of why what happened next matters so much. It explained everything the truth explained, and it flipped the shame onto the humans, and it gave the Dustborn billions, who desperately did not want to believe their empire had abandoned them, a story they could accept instead, a story where the empire was the victim and the strangers were the villains. People want to believe the comfortable thing. The high castes knew that, and for a few hours on the 8th day, the lie worked. I felt the mood shift in the lower tiers around me, felt the doubt creep in, felt the terrible question form. What if the humans did take them? What if it's a trick? The truth Mara Sund had carried so far began, for the first time, to waver. And Mara Sund did the thing that ended it, the thing that taught me, finally and completely, what humans are. She let them aboard. She opened her ship. She broadcast an invitation in the clear to the whole Imperium, come and see. She invited an Imperial delegation, high caste, whoever they wished to send with whatever verification they required, to board her vessel in deep space, inside the Core's own defenses, and see the survivors of Cethran's Reach for themselves, and ask them freely, without human handlers present, whether they had been rescued or kidnapped. She gave up her only protection to do it. As long as her ship was sealed and broadcasting, the Imperium could not easily take it without proving the crime. The moment she opened it, she was vulnerable. She put herself and 100,000 lives into the hands of the empire that wanted them gone, on nothing but the bet that the truth, allowed to speak for itself, face to face, would be stronger than the lie. It was insane. It was the same insanity as the steady course on my board on the first day, the insanity of a creature that has decided the truth is worth more than her own survival. And the high castes, who could not refuse the invitation without admitting they feared what the delegation would find, sent their people aboard. I was there when the delegation reported back, because by the 8th day the watch chamber had become the nerve center of the whole crisis, and a third-tier analyst who had tracked the ship from the first moment was, improbably, in the room. The delegation went aboard expecting to find frightened captives or human deception. What they found was 100,000 of the Imperium's own people, free, unguarded, who had spent 11 years among the humans and who told the delegation, one after another in their own words, the truth, that the Empire had left them to die and the humans had saved them, and that they had asked to come home, and that the humans had risked everything to bring them. There was no kidnapping. There was no ransom. There was only the unbearable fact, spoken by the abandoned themselves, to the faces of the high caste and broadcast, because Mara Sund made sure of that too, to the whole listening Imperium. The lie died there. You cannot maintain a lie when the people it is told about stand up free and contradict it to your face in front of everyone. The high caste story collapsed in a single afternoon, and what was left, naked and undeniable, was the truth. The ascendant Imperium had abandoned 140,000 of its own to die, and humans had saved them, and the Empire had just tried to call those humans thieves rather than admit it. And that final lie, attempted and exposed, was worse for the Imperium than the original crime, because the original crime was old and could be blamed on dead administrators. But the lie was the living high castes, caught trying to deceive their own people on a galactic stage. The Imperium did not fall in fire. I want you to understand that because the title of this story makes you expect an ending in fire, and there was none. The single human warship that headed for the Imperial Core never fired a shot, and the core was never breached by weapons, and the throne world stood untouched. What fell was not the walls. What fell was the thing the walls protected, the frozen order, the 10,000-year certainty that the high castes were wise, and the order was perfect, and the empire protected its own. That certainty had been the real foundation of the Imperium, deeper than any fortress moon, and a single human captain had flown one unarmed ship into the heart of it and broken it with the truth. And once it was broken, it could not be rebuilt, because 100 billion dust-born citizens had heard the names and seen the lie, and would never again believe the order was perfect, or that their lives counted for nothing, or that the empire above them was anything but a thing that had abandoned them and tried to hide it. The change did not come all at once. Empires are vast and they fall slowly, but it came. The emperor's bloodline, faced with a populace that had stopped being afraid, faced with the choice every cornered power eventually faces, to massacre its own people to maintain the lie in front of a galaxy now watching closely, or to change, chose in the end to change. Slowly, grudgingly, incompletely, but the frozen order thawed tier by tier over the years that followed, because once the dust-born knew the truth, the old certainty could never freeze them solid again. Mara Sund had not destroyed the Imperium. She had done something the Imperium could not survive, which was to make it honest, in front of everyone all at once. The survivors of Cethran's Reach came home. They landed on the throne world alive, welcomed at last because the Imperium no longer dared do otherwise, and the homecoming was broadcast across 10,000 worlds, and the abandoned dustborn of a labor caste colony were received as something the Imperium had never received any of the low castes as before, as people whose lives had mattered, whose loss was a wound, whose return was a joy. It was the first crack in 10,000 years of contempt. It would not be the last. And Mara Sund, the human captain who had flown the truth into the heart of an empire, who had refused to fire and refused to flee and refused, at the very end, to keep even her own safety when the truth required her to give it up, Mara Sund left. That is the part I think about most. When the survivors were home and the truth was loose, and the empire was already beginning, in its slow, vast way, to change, she did not stay to be honored. She did not demand reward or recognition or anything at all. She turned her single ship around, the same ship that had crossed the most defended space in the galaxy, and she flew it back out the way she had come, and the Imperium, which 9 days before would have destroyed her on sight, let her pass, because there was no one left in the whole empire who did not understand, by then, what she had done and why. I met her once. I should tell you that, because it is the reason I am the one telling this story. In the days after, in the strange Thoin chaos, a service caste analyst who had tracked her ship from the first moment was permitted, improbably, in the new and uncertain order, to be among those who saw her before she left. And I, who had never in my life been asked my opinion about anything, found myself standing before the small, unremarkable human who had broken my empire with the truth, and I did not know what to say, and what came out was the question that had haunted me since the first day. I asked her, why fly into certain death for 100,000 strangers from an empire that had abandoned them and would have killed you to hide it? You are one ship. You are one small person. Why? And Mara's son, tired, ordinary, smaller than I'd imagined, with none of the legend on her in person, looked at me, a dust-born analyst of a people her own kind had every reason to despise, and she said, "Because somebody left them in the dark, and we found them. And once you've found people who have been left in the dark, you can't just leave them there too. You become the thing that left them." She shrugged. "And they wanted to come home, that's the whole thing. They wanted to come home, and home was scared of the truth, and somebody had to be willing to carry the truth through the front door even if the door shot back. That's all I did. I was just willing to carry it." She looked at me a moment longer, and then she said the thing I have carried ever since, the thing that finally made me understand my whole frozen life. "Your empire taught you all to be afraid. That's its whole strength. 100 billion people too afraid to say the true thing out loud. But here's what they never told you, because it's the one thing that ends them." A small, tired smile. "Fear only works on people who have something to lose that they're not willing to lose. The second somebody decides the truth matters more than their own safety, just one person, just once, the whole thing cracks. That's all I was. One person who decided the truth mattered more than me. You've got 100 billion of those waiting inside you. They just have to find out it's allowed. They just have to find out it's allowed." I left the watch not long after. The Imperium I had served was gone, even if its walls still stood, and I found in the thawing years that the quick mind I had spent my whole life keeping quiet had things it wanted to say after all. I became, in the slow new order, something that the old Imperium had no place for, a teller of the truth. I tell this story mostly. I tell it to the dust-born, the low tiers, the children of the people who spent 10,000 years afraid, and I tell them what a single human captain taught a single service caste analyst, which is the most dangerous and most hopeful thing I know. The Empire detected one unknown warship, and it headed straight for the Imperial Core. And the whole Empire braced for a weapon, because the Empire understood weapons. The Empire had spent 10,000 years being unbreakable against weapons. But the ship carried no weapon. It carried the truth, and 100,000 people the Empire had thrown away, and one small, unafraid human who had decided that some things matter more than living. And against that, the unbreakable core had no defense at all. That is why the stars fear them. Not because they cannot be stopped by force, everything can be stopped by force. Because the thing humans bring is not force. It is the truth, carried by someone willing to die for it, straight into the heart of whatever lie is biggest. And there has never been a wall in all the long history of the galaxy that could keep that out. The dust just had to find out it was allowed to stop being afraid. A human flew 9 days into the center of the galaxy to tell us that it was.